Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy. I'm Vanshika Saraf, a research analyst at the Indo-Pacific Studies Program. And in today's episode, we'll discuss how India is managing the intersection between its global power aspirations on one hand and the constraints created by its neighbourhood on the other. To discuss this further, we have with us today Dr. Chietigj Bajpee. He is a senior research fellow for South Asia in the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. Prior to joining Chatham House, he was a political risk advisor for Asia at a Norwegian company, Equinor, and he's completed his PhD from King's College London and National University of Singapore. Welcome, Dr. Bajpee. Glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So recently, Chatham House published a paper titled Competing Visions of International Order, Responses to US Power in a Fracturing World. It examines how global actors perceive and position themselves within the evolving world order. It brings together expert analysis from countries including India, China, Russia, Iran, Japan, to name a few, and offers insights into how these states are either seeking to reform, adapt, or resist the current order. And a key contribution of this paper is India's position, which is authored by Dr. Bajpee, where he argues that India is not an anti-Western actor, but a non-Western actor. So I thought, in light of that paper, it's important to discuss the recent developments that have taken place and put that into perspective. And to start, I think a good place would be to discuss the aftermath of Operation Sindoor. And after the recent India Pakistan escalation, we saw that both sides embarked on a parallel diplomatic engagement with major powers, with developing nations. They sent all party delegations. So, to start off with the first question, Dr. Bajpee, to what extent do you think, as you've termed them, global charm offensives, how have they altered entrenched perceptions? And what do you think it says about India's persuasive power? And where do the limits of this power lie?
So I should start by saying that I had the opportunity to interact with both countries' multi-party parliamentary delegations. They were in London over the last month. And it's interesting to note that both countries sought to internationalize the recent conflict, but in different ways. So Pakistan has sought to facilitate third-party mediation, and it has sought to internationalize the Kashmir issue. India, of course, opposes this. But it still sought to internationalize the issue in its own way by framing Pakistan as the epicenter of global terrorism. It had reminders of the fact that Osama bin Laden had been killed in Pakistan in 2011. Wall Street Journal journalist Daniel Pearl was beheaded in Pakistan in 2002. And on your question on the effectiveness of these charm offenses, frankly, I think both countries face an uphill battle in trying to get their message across to the international community. So for India, the global war on terrorism has lost the resonance that it once had. And this makes it difficult for New Delhi to make the case to the world on the severity of Pakistan's threat to global stability. And for Pakistan, the effort to get U.S. or Western involvement in the India-Pakistan issue, and on the issue of Kashmir, I think that is an uphill battle as well, given the plethora of international and domestic crises confronting Western capitals. And frankly, South Asia has lost the strategic significance it once had, particularly after the U.S. And NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. We saw the Trump administration's relatively nonchalant statements on the India-Pakistan hostilities. J.D. Vance, the vice president, had called India-Pakistan tensions fundamentally none of our business. Trump had initially said that India and Pakistan will figure it out one way or the other. The U.S. did eventually change its position as tensions escalated. But I think the Trump administration's proclivity to no longer want to play the role of the world's policeman, to see the world through some sort of spheres of influence prism in which South Asia is not a primary area of concern, I think that has not really changed. So as a result, I'm not entirely convinced that either country was effective in getting its position across to the international community in the way it would have liked.
Right, right. And I think on both sides there was this battle of this narrative battle, which, as you said, both did not really succeed in. So, given also other changes in the neighborhood, say for example the crisis with Bangladesh, where really it was a shock to India, and it's a political problem that we're still dealing with. Um, how is India pursuing its global power status while being so constrained structurally by the neighborhood challenges that remain unresolved? And do you think these ambitions that we keep talking about, how will they succeed, and can they succeed if our own regional backyard remains so fragile?
So countries have, of course, risen to power, great global power status, despite having difficult relations with their neighbors. China is a prime example of this. You could go back further in history, and you can point to Tsarist Russia or the Soviet Union, pre-Second World War Germany. But I think a challenging neighborhood does make this rise more difficult. So I think it's naive to assume that India can somehow transcend its neighborhood. Even the most powerful states in the world have their most significant sources of insecurity along their periphery. So if we look to the United States, for instance, arguably its greatest security crisis came from a neighboring country, Cuba, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. If you see the political discourse within the United States today, again, it's about the neighborhood, which illegal migration from its southern border is seen as a significant source of insecurity. And in Europe, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is on Europe's doorstep and represents the greatest source of insecurity to the European continent. And I don't think India is any different. And this is not merely a question of India's border tensions recently that we've seen with China or Pakistan. There are also broader structural challenges in the neighborhood. You have four countries in its neighborhood that are in the midst of IMF bailouts. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and two countries which could be regarded as failed or near failed states. And of course, here I'm referring to Myanmar and Afghanistan. As such, I think it is justified to ask this question of whether India can successfully rise without its region, particularly when this instability that I've referred to is accompanied by a very low level of economic integration or regional integration, intra-regional trade in South Asia. 5 to 7% of total trade in South Asia is intra-regional trade, and you compare that to say Southeast Asia, the ASEAN economies, where it's about 25%. And I think we also need to remember that China, regionalized its economy before it globalized in terms of expanding its trade and integrating its economy with neighboring countries. And that is helped to cement its centrality to global supply chains and transnational production networks. And I think India will need to follow a similar path itself.
Sure, I think you've laid down some great examples in history to illustrate the fact that we cannot necessarily rise to a certain level without rising with our neighbors. So, in that context, what do you think are some practical, which might even be very uncomfortable steps that we need to take to stabilize our relationship? Of course, it won't be the same approach because each of our neighbors needs to be approached and dealt with in a different way. But despite these several flashpoints that we keep seeing that keep recurring, since you've argued this in the past, do you see sort of any positive trend lines also of the region, trending towards some sort of peace and cooperation framework, or is that something that's still very elusive?
So I would first draw inspiration from India's previous foreign policy initiatives. And here in particular, I'm thinking about the Gujarat Doctrine, which essentially recognized that India's stature cannot be isolated from relations with its neighbors, and it advocated for the importance of maintaining friendly relations with neighboring countries through a policy of non-reciprocity. So I don't think difficult relations with Pakistan and China should inhibit broader institutional and economic integration. We have, of course, seen steps on this front, through initiatives like BIMSTEC or IORA, where Pakistan and China are not members. We've seen, momentum on strengthening connectivity in the region through initiatives like the BBIN, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal. But even what progress we have seen, I think, has been slow moving to some degree. BIMSTEC, for instance, has only held 6 summit meetings since it was founded in 1997. So we can't, blame the slow progress on difficult India-Pakistan relations. Pakistan, of course, is not a member of BIMSTEC. Infrastructure projects in Myanmar have been delayed by instabilities in that country, and this has undermined India's Look East or Act East ambitions to some degree. I think on the direction of travel, I think that's somewhat difficult to predict. But I would say that the regional alignments are in flux. Pakistan has maintained this, long-standing all-weather relationship with China. Bhutan maintains a close relationship with India, but every other country in the region maintains fluid alignments. We've seen this most vividly with developments in Bangladesh following the removal of the Sheikh Hasina government last August, and as a result, we've seen that government, or the current interim government, has distanced itself from India. It's moved somewhat closer to Pakistan, but at the same time, we've seen, Afghanistan under the Taliban has surprisingly distanced itself from Pakistan and moved closer to India. So, as I said, these regional alignments are in flux. And while it is difficult, I would say, to predict a lasting regional peace or cooperation in the subcontinent, I think there is some silver lining, and that is that the key flashpoint in South Asia, which is of course between India and Pakistan. I think nuclear deterrence appears to have worked to some degree. So even during the most recent hostilities that we've seen between both countries, which we've seen a steady movement up the escalation ladder with each subsequent period of tension. But the emphasis has always been on precision strike operations, limiting collateral damage. Contrast that with other major global flashpoints. See what we're seeing in Ukraine or in Gaza, where we've seen significant civilian casualties. So I think South Asia is in this unique position of being both the most likely to experience a potential nuclear conflict, but it's also the most restrained of the world's major flashpoints. So I think if there's any positive takeaway, it is that this is, if you think about where South Asia was in the late 1990s, then President Bill Clinton had referred to Kashmir as the world's most dangerous flashpoint. I mean, and until the developments in the terrorist attack in Pelgam in April, the subsequent Operation Sindoor, it to some degree this had fallen off the radar. There's far more focus on what's going on in Ukraine or what's going on in the Middle East or in the Taiwan Strait. So I think that to some degree demonstrates a degree of strategic restraint, which we don't see in other global flashpoints.
Right, right. And so just to talk about our largest neighbor, which is China, this week we saw a lot of things happening, especially with the SCO summit going on. So India's national security advisor met with the Chinese foreign minister, where India did not join SCO's statement on Iran and Israel. But on the other hand, we saw the Kailash Mansarovar pilgrimage route being resumed after almost 5 years, which is one of the confidence building measures that was discussed last year in October during disengagement talks. So there was some positive developments, some negative, especially also that a few days ago there was a trilateral meeting which China held with Pakistan and Bangladesh. So how do you interpret these contradictory signals in India-China relations?
So it's interesting. I asked this same question to the Indian parliamentary delegation when they were visiting London about whether recent India-Pakistan hostilities had derailed any of the progress that had been made trying to renormalize the China-India relationship over the last year. And the response I got seemed to indicate an effort to compartmentalize or separate, India's relations with Pakistan and other South Asian neighbors from its relations with China. The delegation mentioned that, despite challenges in the India-China relationship, that both sides have essentially learned to handle their differences in a mature manner through diplomatic efforts. And I think the same goes for the Chinese side. I think Beijing does not want to derail the nascent rapprochement that it's seen with India. So we've seen a concerted effort by Beijing to try and stabilize relations with neighboring countries in recent months, not only India, I would also include Japan and others. And this is essentially as part of an effort to focus on what China perceives to be its key or primary strategic rival for at the moment, which is the United States. But as you mentioned, as we can see from this week's meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, defense ministers in Qingdao, where the Indian side refused to sign the joint communique amid disagreements over the language pertaining to terrorism and regional security. I think it is becoming increasingly difficult to separate the China-India relationship from China's outreach and engagement and relations with other countries around India's periphery, most notably Pakistan, but also Bangladesh and others. I mean, on the most recent India-Pakistan hostilities, China, of course, is a party to the Kashmir dispute through its claim in Eastern Ladakh, Aksai Chin, and the slice of territory that Pakistan handed over to China in 1963, the Shaksgam Trans-Karakoram Tract. And during the most recent period of hostilities between India and Pakistan, Beijing referred to Pakistan as its ironclad friend. It said that it fully understands Pakistan's legitimate security concerns, and it called for an impartial investigation into the Pahalgam terrorist attack. So, and then add to that, the context of China trying to block efforts to list Pakistan-based terrorist organizations on UN sanctions lists. So China is clearly not a neutral party to the Kashmir issue or the India-Pakistan hostilities. And I think add to this is that the most is Pakistan's growing dependence on Chinese military hardware. China, of course, counts for over 80% of Pakistan's arms imports over the last 5 years. And we saw this most, visibly during the most recent hostilities. Chinese PL-15 air-to-air missiles or J-10 fighter aircraft being employed by the Pakistani Air Force in combat operations against India. And I think this dependence is only going to grow over time. And particularly as we see the Chinese military platforms improve, become more advanced, we could see the more sophisticated weapon systems being provided by China to Pakistan. So fifth generation J-35 aircraft, for instance. And I think this is going to be a concern for India. So putting aside what their official positions may be, that they're continuing with this sort of nascent rapprochement, I think China is becoming a more direct party to India-Pakistan tensions, and I think it is a thorn. And in China's outreach to neighboring countries in the region, I think is a thorn in the bilateral relationship, despite what official statements may claim.
Right, right. That's a very important note to take away. So now, Dr. Bajpayee, just to sort of zoom out and move on to, let's say, the bigger picture and bring in the West, quite literally. But so India and the so-called its Western partners, they on some level share similar interests, especially say when it comes to China. But as you've argued elsewhere, that sometimes they inhabit or they occupy very different geopolitical and intellectual worlds. Uh, that can be in terms of norms, values, geopolitical priorities. So, how do you believe that this divergence, whether do you believe is it narrowing, or are we actually seeing deeper fault lines emerge, especially post Ukraine and now post the Iran Israel conflict?
So, first of all, I would perhaps add a bit of nuance to your question. So, in the sense that the West is not a monolithic entity. The United States under the Trump administration is pursuing a more transactional, value neutral, one could almost call it a might is right foreign policy. And you contrast that with Europe. Europe maintains a continued commitment to upholding the rules-based international order. And even within Europe, there are countries that pursue a more commercially driven foreign policy, countries like the UK, France, and Germany, and others that pursue a more value-driven foreign policy. Baltic states, Central European states, countries like Lithuania or the Czech Republic. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach when we talk about the West. Add to that, I think that each issue needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So, for instance, you mentioned, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I would argue that, European countries are far more concerned about the India-Russia relationship than the U.S. is. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, poses an existential threat to the security of Europe, whereas the U.S. Even before Trump assumed power, there was a tendency by some in Washington to see the Ukraine conflict as a sideshow, that the real long term strategic threat emanates from China, not Russia. And we've seen this with reoccurring efforts by successive US administrations to pivot towards the Indo Pacific. So as a result, I would say, Washington has been maybe somewhat less critical of the India Russia relationship than Brussels or other European capitals. On the Middle East, India's position actually seems more aligned with the West than other countries in the global South. India has advocated for a two-state solution on the Israel-Palestine issue, but at the same time, it's been somewhat less critical of Israel's actions than other countries. And we saw this, for instance, with India distancing itself from the SCO statement that was critical of Israeli strikes on Iran. So I would say that overall, I think India continues to prioritize its relations with the West, and I think Minister of External Affairs Jaishankar, I think he said it best, and he made this abundantly clear during this year's Raisina dialogue that we both attended, where he referred to the countries with which India is conducting free trade negotiations, which include the US, the UK, the EU. He said that these are India's key technology, its key innovation, its key strategic partners. So I think the direction of travel is towards deepening relations with the West, notwithstanding these occasional, these frictions that we see on particular issues.
Right. So, coming to the India US relationship, you've argued that actually requires a healthy dose of realism rather than rhetoric. But given the growing gaps in expectations, especially between India and the US when it comes to trade, when it comes to technology, or even regional security, as we've discussed before, how do you see the India US partnership playing out, especially under Trump?
So, frankly, I think some of the shine has come off the India-US relationship, particularly after the recent India-Pakistan tension. So, I don't think New Delhi is clearly not happy with Trump claiming responsibility for the ceasefire, his offer to mediate on the Kashmir issue, and claims of exercising some form of economic leverage or pressure on both countries. So, in doing so, the US clearly went against India's position, which is to not internationalize the Kashmir issue, to not rehyphenate or hyphenate the India-Pakistan relationship, and to not draw a false equivalency between India and Pakistan's actions. And then, obviously, to add further insult to injury, we saw Trump recently host Pakistani Army Chief Asim Munir. Um, that being said, I think these developments don't undermine the India-US relationship. I think the direction of travel essentially remains unchanged. New Delhi still sees the US as a key strategic partner, which we see a continued momentum on concluding a bilateral trade agreement, although this has clearly turned out to be more challenging than initially perceived. Contrary to expectations that India would be the first country to secure a deal, we've now heard about deals being concluded with both the UK and China. And there's several contentious issues such as agriculture, and of course, but I think that the direction of travel remains unchanged. India is scheduled to host President Trump later this year when it hosts the Quad Summit for the first time. But I think these recent developments are a bit of a wake-up call for New Delhi. I think it challenges the view that India has some sort of special relationship with the US, and it reaffirms the necessity of India's long-standing commitment to strategic autonomy in its foreign policy. So essentially meaning that it needs to hedge its bets, not put all of its eggs in one basket. It needs to engage all major poles of influence in the international system, including countries with which the US and the West has a history of difficult relations, which would include countries like Iran, Russia, but also China.
Right. I like how you put it that the shine of the relationship is coming off, peeling off a little bit now. So, since you mentioned the Quad Summit, which is to be held later this year, the Leaders Summit, we'll see a foreign ministers meeting soon. Next month, perhaps it's on the horizon. So, what is your assessment of how the Quad has evolved, especially from the first Trump era, from where it really sort of kick-started, to how the current agenda of the Quad is playing out, and do you feel that there has been a certain level of maturity and where it's gone beyond just mere geopolitical signaling? How do you see it evolve?
So first of all, the Quad is, of course, this grouping of Asia's four major maritime democracies: Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. It has its origins in issues of maritime security following the response to the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. But I think increasingly what we've seen is its mandate has expanded to focus on issues of non-traditional security, supply chain resilience, pandemic response, climate risk. I think on India's position, I think its commitment has to this initiative has got a boost following the border clashes that we saw between China and India in 2020. Which essentially made India less apprehensive about participating in initiatives that it previously saw as offending Beijing. I mean, it's important to remember that the Quad actually it didn't emerge under the Trump administration. It re-emerged under the Trump administration. It actually emerged back in 2007, but it didn't last very long, and it was essentially revived under the Trump administration. And as I said, as I'd mentioned in the earlier question, India has of course will be hosting the Quad summit for the first time this year. So I think it is committed to this initiative. The U.S. position, I think, is a little bit more unclear at this point, as most things are under the Trump administration. So, Trump has questioned a lot of the foreign policy initiatives that have been pursued by his predecessors. For instance, AUKUS, but it has shown a continued commitment to the Quad. We saw the meeting of the Quad foreign ministers the day after Trump's inauguration. But I think this grouping, its purpose, its identity, I think it's still in a state of flux to some degree. We've seen the emerging of other initiatives. I mentioned AUKUS, but also the Squad grouping of countries. So the Squad is essentially the Quad minus India, but plus the Philippines, which is more focused on issues of traditional security, maritime security. So I think a key watch point will be to see if the Trump administration seeks to pivot the focus of the Quad more towards its hard security dimensions. Over sort of the soft or non-traditional security issues which have gained ground in recent years. So, for instance, issues like climate. So I think that will potentially be a key watch point to see with the upcoming Quad meetings and the Quad summit, which takes place later this year.
Right, right. So now, just to move on to the other West, it's clear that the transatlantic rift is widening, and we're seeing, especially with the NATO summit, that Europe is recalibrating its strategic priorities. So I just want to know, where do you feel India fits into this gap? And also, we've seen the recent very successful conclusion of India UK FTA negotiations, which hasn't been finalized yet but is on the path to do so. We're seeing progress on the India EU FTA. So, how do you see the ties between India and Europe progressing?
So I think as transatlantic relations have become more strained, European capitals have tried to forge coalitions with the so-called like-minded countries. And India, I think, in this context is seen as a partner of choice, given its credentials as the world's largest democracy. And we see, Europe is essentially trying to cling to values in an increasingly valueless world. And in that context, India is seen as an ideal partner. Add to that, of course, India's large IT educated workforce, strong digital ecosystem, ambitions to emerge as a global manufacturing hub. All of this offers a means by which Europe can also reduce its dependence on China in areas of critical and emerging technology. So I think, and this has been reflected in the string of FTA negotiations, FTAs, free trade agreements that have either recently been concluded with the UK, recently last year with the EFTA countries, ongoing negotiations with the EU. It seems to me, essentially a form of strategic hedging. So it comes at a time of growing economic uncertainty, fueled by the Trump administration's, so-called reciprocal tariff policies, and this has accelerated efforts to forge these agreements between like-minded countries. And I think in that context, it's important. The strategic significance of these free trade agreements is as important as their economic importance. Minister Jaishankar, when he was here in the UK, he came to speak at Chatham House, and he made this point abundantly clear. He referred to the India UK FTA he said that this would have a larger relationship impact beyond the economic and trade impact on the India-UK relationship. And I think that's also applicable to other FTA negotiations that are going on with the EU, for instance. And I sometimes, refer to these free trade agreements as the Europe and the UK's nuclear deal moment. And what I mean by that is the civil nuclear deal that was concluded between the US and India 2 decades ago. So beyond the significance of that deal in facilitating civil nuclear cooperation between the US and India, the deal was even more important in symbolizing a deepening of the India-US strategic partnership. And I think we should view these free trade agreements with the UK, with the EFTA countries, with the EU through a similar prism, not only for their economic significance, but also for the broader strategic significance of deepening India's relations with these countries.
Right, right. I agree with that view of yours, and I think it's important to look at it more broadly. So just to finally sort of come to the last question, and this pertains to the central argument in your paper for the Chatham House publication, which is that India is not anti-Western but is non-Western. So I would just like to know, how does this worldview, how does it manifest practically in India's foreign policy? And does the current international climate make it harder or perhaps make it easier for India to sustain this positioning?
So, this idea of India as non-Western but not explicitly anti-Western, I think it manifests in several areas. It essentially, allows India to bake its cake and eat it as well. What other country in the world is a member of both the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Quad, or maintains close diplomatic relations with both Moscow and Washington, D.C., in the context of the war in Ukraine, or for that matter, with close relations with both Tehran and Tel Aviv in the context of the recent Iran-Israel conflict, or for that matter, able to promote itself as a voice of the global South while also pursuing deepening defense and technology cooperation with the West. So I think this idea of India being non-Western but not anti-Western, about essentially serving as some sort of bridge between the West and the rest, I think that manifests in these relationships. I think the challenge for India is going to be to maintain this position in an increasingly unstable, bifurcated, and potentially polarized international system. So India has promoted itself, under the Modi government, it's promoted itself as this Vishwamitra or a Vishwabandhu, a friend of the world. But there's a big difference in being a friend of the world and helping the world make friends with each other. So, I think India is going to come under growing pressure to step up. So, whether it means through mediation, conflict resolution, or even taking sides in conflicts. India, of course, has experience in doing so. If we can look back in the 1950s, India's role during the Korean War or the French Indochina War, it continues to be active in several areas of global governance. So whether it be in terms of its contribution to UN peacekeeping operations or its naval deployments to protect freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean region, or its supply of COVID vaccines to countries in the global south. But I think one area where it has come under greater scrutiny has been on this issue of mediation. We've seen other countries, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, have been far more active on several global flashpoints. So whether it be on Russia, Ukraine, or whether it be on the conflicts in Gaza. Even China had offered a 12-point proposal. So I think this is an area where India is going to come under more pressure to potentially step up. If it wants to, play a more prominent role on the world stage.
Right. And so, just to conclude, I'd like to leave our listeners with something that I found very interesting in your paper. Is you've mentioned how India's worldviews are guided by three grand strategic prescriptions, and that has defined how our foreign policy has evolved. First of which is Nehruvianism, which is characterized by non alignment, solidarity with the developing world. The second is neoliberalism, an emphasis on economic interactions, mutual gain. And the third is hyperrealism, which emphasizes the importance of the military and the balance of power. And I think we can see these three features play out not only in our neighborhood, where we see a certain sense of mutual, enabling mutual growth and solidarity with our neighbors, a sense of brotherhood. We're seeing increasing economic investments, be it through infrastructure, be it through developmental aid, and thirdly, we also see an importance of the military. Say, for example, when it comes to dealing with Myanmar, we haven't shunned the military government. We've continued to engage with them in ways that are possible. And similarly, we see these three features also play out when it comes to other global actors, the US or Europe or Israel and Iran. So, thank you so much, Dr. Bajpee, for today's podcast. It was a very interesting session, and I hope our listeners enjoyed as well.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.